Okay, welcome everyone. Before we go to the Parsha of the week, I have to mention that today is Gimel Tammuz, the third day of the month of Tammuz. And this is the day that the late Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away. 27 years ago, Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away on this day, Gimel Tammuz. And in the world of Chabad, so it's become a very, very important day to commemorate and acknowledge the work of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. For those who want, I did record a short 6-minute video that we put up on our Facebook and Twitter, speaking more about the Rebbe and Chabad. I'm not going to go back over all of that, but I do want to acknowledge that he was like one in many, many, many generations. The inspiration that inspired the worldwide Chabad movement is it's really beyond belief. It's really beyond belief how Chabad is spread out all over the world, doing the most incredible work in the world. And it really all comes from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. When he began, the Chabad movement was quite literally a very, very, very small group in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. And now it has spread everywhere around the world. So those who are interested, you can, someone just asked, Brenda asked, is it on our site? I'm not sure if it's on our site yet. I know it's on Twitter and Facebook. It might be on our site. I just don't know. Anyways, I just really wanted to acknowledge the great work of the Chabad movement and the honor and the appreciation that the whole Jewish world should have for the Lubavitcher Rebbe and everything he accomplished. Today is Parshat Chukat. It's a very, very full parsha. And one of the themes that runs through it, which we're not going to deal with today, is the idea of paradox. So when we look at all the different things that are happening in this parsha, there is a thread connecting everything of paradox. But we're going to deal with, in a sense, another thread that is not running just this parsha, but through the entire Torah. But it has 3 different incidences in this parsha that point the way for us to discuss it. And that is, we're going to look at parable, allegory, symbolism, and metaphor tonight. And you'll understand why in just a few minutes. So where I'm starting is, for those who have a Chumash near you, it's in the 21st chapter of Numbers, verses 17 and 18. And there is a song that is sung. It's one of the 10 archetypal songs sung throughout creation. And it's a very short song. And it says like this: Then Israel sang this song. And here are the words of the song. Come up, O well, and announce it. The well that the princes dug, that the nobles of the people dug, through a lawgiver with their staff, a gift from the wilderness. That was the song. That's the words to the song. How the song went exactly, we don't know. But these are the words to the song. And on the superficial understanding, it's about water. This is the well that the princes dug. that the nobles of the people dug through a lawgiver with their staff, a gift from the wilderness. But we have a principle in the Talmud that says any place in the Torah where water is mentioned, it is an allusion to Torah itself. Meaning you could, through metaphor, parable, allegory, and symbolism, you could understand anytime it mentions water as telling us something about Torah. So here, the lawgiver, of course, is Moshe. And remember how in way back in the book of Exodus, he drew water from the rock with his staff. And in this parsha, he hits the rock instead of speak to it. And for that reason, which is a whole discussion of itself, God said Moshe can't come into the land. But here, the people are extolling the idea that they have water in the desert, a gift from the wilderness. But now we're going to see that this gift is allusion to Torah. In other words, the water that the lawgiver is drawing is the Torah itself. But this we only know if you look at the story as a parable, as a metaphor for something else. So right after this song, it gives a geographical description of the travels of Bnei Yisrael. And it says like this, that they went from the Midbar to Matana. These are names of places, but we're going to see very shortly, each one of these names has a meaning other than a geographical description. They went from the Midbar to the Matana, and from Matana to Nachliel, and from Nachliel to Bamot, and from Bamot to Haggai, in the field of Moab, at the top of the peak, overlooking the surface of Yeshimon. So one of the greatest sages, Rava, so he interprets this all as a parable, that it's not talking just about the names of places. And this is how he interprets it. So from Midbar to Matana. Matana means a gift. Now remember, in the song, the people sang a gift from the wilderness. The wilderness is Midbar. So when it says they went from Midbar to Matana, Rava says what it's saying is that from the Midbar of Sinai, where we received the Torah as a gift, a matana. And then they went from matana to Nachliel. Nachliel comes from the word nachala, which means an inheritance. So when Israel received the Torah in the desert, the Midbar, as a gift, it became an eternal inheritance. And from Nachliel to Bamot, one of the, we'll call it a suburb of Jerusalem, is called Ramot. So Bamot also means a high place. So Rava interprets that if you receive the Torah and you realize it's a gift from God and you make it your inheritance, then God will raise you up as if you're standing on the top of a mountain. You've inherited this great height of spirituality. Then it says they went from Bamot to Haggai. Haggai is a valley. Well, that's the opposite of a high mountain. So Rava says that if God raises you up through the Torah and you become haughty or arrogant about it, then you will be taken down into a valley. And this is the field of Moab, overlooking the surface of Yeshimon. Yeshimon means a destructive place. a place of destruction. So if you allow arrogance and haughtiness to enter into the equation of you receiving the Torah as a gift, then you'll end up destroying everything that you've been given. So here we see that if you would just read it in the Torah, you would just read it. They went from this place to that place to that place to that place. But here Rabbi is explaining it completely different. He's explaining it as a parable in symbolic, allegorical terms. So now, right after that, there's a third incident. And this is, one second. This is where the Torah says, I'm just looking for the source. Give me 1 second here, 1 second. Okay, so this is verse 27 in chapter 21. And this is after Israel has defeated the king called Sichon. And as a result of that, the Torah says, therefore, those that speak in parables, it actually has the word mashalim, mashal. In Hebrew, the word for parable is mashal. So it says, and those that speak in parables, they say, come to Cheshbon, it will be built and established, the city of Sichon. And then it continues further. So interestingly enough, we have the question, after two examples of parables, the Torah actually mentions those that speak in parables. So Rashi says, who is it talking about? Bilam. And if you look back actually we haven't gotten there yet. If you look in the parsha of Balak, when Bilam is the heathen prophet that Balak hires to curse the Jews, so over and over again, when he tries to curse the Jews, it says that Bilam lifted up his parable and he gave over these, what he wanted to be curses, but God put it in his mouth to say blessings. But all of the blessings are given over in a parable kind of terms. And in that parsha, it says it the same thing, that Bilam lifted up his parable over and over again. So because of all of this, I wanted to explore this idea of parable in the Torah, because this is the only parsha along with Bilam where it actually uses the word mashal, parable. So the first thing we can say is that, and especially for people who have my book, The Orchard of Delights. So the orchard here is what's called Pardes. And this is the system of learning according to 4 different levels. Pardes is an acronym. The P of Pardes is for Pshat, the simple, literal storyline of the text. The R, or the Resh of Pardes, is Remez. These are the hints and allusions in the in the Torah. You've heard me talk a little bit about my new book, 70 Faces of the Torah. Well, this is what it's all about. What are these hints? What are these allusions? There's a method, there are methodologies behind this. But the third one is drush, the D of Pardes. And drush means the homilectic, allegorical, metaphorical, parable, and symbolic meaning of the Torah. This is the source of the word midrash, or literally the house of study is called Beit HaMidrash, the house of digging deeper into the Torah through understanding that on every level of the Torah, it can be understood as a parable, as a metaphor, and the symbolic language, as we just had in the song and these geographical descriptions. And then the samech, the S of Pardes, is of course the sod, the secret meaning, the Kabbalistic, mystical, spiritual foundations behind every word of the Torah. Now, what's very, very interesting is if you look at Rashi. Rashi is probably the most known commentary on the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses. There are many other commentaries, hundreds of other commentaries, but Rashi has a very, very special place. In every printed Chumash has Rashi in it. And Rashi is known for giving over what's called the simple, literal, straightforward understanding of the text. And in at least one place, he says, I have only come to explain the simple meaning of the text. But what you find paradoxically, if you look at Rashi, half of everything that Rashi says is based on a midrash. And you say, well, wait a minute. I thought midrash is the metaphor, the allegory, the symbolic. How is that the simple meaning? So these categories are not so black and white. And that's what makes Rashi so amazing, is that how he's able to blend all the different levels and in his attempt to give over the most direct, literal understanding of the text. But he uses midrash all of the time. So an example that we can use is the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. If you read the Song of Songs, it sounds like a beautiful love story between a man and a woman taking place in the springtime in Eretz Yisrael. But when you look at all of the commentaries, virtually all of the commentaries, it's understood that it is an allegory of the love between God and Israel. And therefore, you could read the story on 2 different levels altogether. So it's interesting, if you look at the Art Scroll version of Shir HaShirim, when it translates it into English, it does not translate it according to its literal meaning. It translates the words according to the allegory that this is a love story between God and Israel. And in the introduction to Art Scroll, it explains that since the literal understanding of the Song of Songs is that the entire thing is a parable, the entire book is an allegory, then that's the proper way to translate it, is the allegory and not what it appears to be as a simple story between a man and woman, springtime in Eretz Yisrael. But really, this is true of the entire Torah. we have another book that the whole book is called a book of parables, and that's Mishlei. King Solomon wrote the Song of Songs, but he also wrote the book. In English, we usually call it Proverbs. But the actual word Mishlei comes from the plural of mashal, which usually we translate as parable. So Proverbs, in a sense, is like a parable. So I just wanted very, very quickly I went to my online dictionary, just so we understand. And here are the definitions that I got for what is a parable. A simple story to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. Sometimes, let's say we'll call it Aesop's fables, is maybe an example. That you have a story, but the story, if you just read it and like don't look into it deeper, okay, you have a simple story. But if you understand from the beginning that this story is trying to give over a moral, ethical, spiritual lesson, then you read it completely different. And what is an allegory? You'll see all of these almost sound the same. So what's an allegory? A story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning. So this we saw in Rava's explanation of the places that Israel went. They went from Midbar to Matana, Matana to Nachliel, Nachliel to Bamot. But he understood that that these names are revealing something much deeper. Now, what about symbolism? The use of symbols to signify ideas and qualities different than the literal sense. So here again, there is a literal understanding, but there's also a deeper parable. And then one more is metaphor. A figure of speech that describes something that is not literally true, but helps explain a comparison or difference. So here you have a metaphor where it's obvious that it's not talking in literal terms, but it's pointing out something. So in the Talmud, literally hundreds of times, they'll be discussing something, and anyone who's learned Talmud knows how complicated it can get. And it appears that the sages understood that the logic and the discussions and the disagreements, you need incredible logic and focus. So in hundreds of cases, they say, B'ma hadavar domeh. What is this thing that we're trying to explain like? And they give over a parable. They take this very complicated, legalistic concept, and they create a simple storyline that anyone could follow. And in English is, to what can this be compared? And then they give over a parable. And in one place in the Talmud, in the tractate of Baba Batra, there are 15 stories given over by Rabbi Bar Chana. And in English, sometimes they're called exaggeration stories. Rabbi Bar Chana had an incredible imagination. And he tells these wild stories. And there's no explanation for them. But everyone understood that he's trying to give over something very, very deep here. And then the challenge becomes, well, how to interpret it? Because there's no commentary from Rabbi Bar Chana how to interpret his stories. So quite literally, over hundreds and hundreds of years, almost thousands, people have been writing commentaries on these stories. Now, one of them is the classic work of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Is called Likutei Ma'aran. That's his classic work. And the first 15 Torahs in Likutei Ma'aran have his attempt at explaining these stories. Now, let me see. No, it doesn't seem that my wife is online, but I will tell her that my wife made a coloring book for children based on these 15 stories, and she drew the pictures. It's a coloring book, but she took the explanation of Rebbe Nachman and put it in poetry form for children. But again, this is all to give an example that this is not the only time in the Talmud where you have these somewhat wild stories that everyone understands immediately that these are allegorical stories. These are parables. Now, I want to bring a very, very important source here. And we're getting towards the end, but this is such an amazing thing. In the book of Exodus, in the Parsha Mishpatim, one of the laws in the Torah that is repeated many times is called cities of refuge. When someone kills someone else accidentally, yet there's some kind of culpability. There's some degree of irresponsibility here, but not enough it's not a murder. It's not intentional, that cities of refuge were set up for people that had to go there. Instead of going to, let's say, jail for third-degree manslaughter, maybe that's what we call it in modern terms, they would go to a city of refuge. And the very words that describe it is the following. But for one who had not waited in ambush, first it says, one who strikes a man who dies, he will be put to death. In other words, Israel allows what's called the death sentence, though the Talmud makes very clear it was virtually never carried out. Some say it was never carried out. Others say it was, if it happened once every 70 years, it was a lot. But then the Torah says, but for one who had not waited in ambush, and God had caused it to come into his hand, I will provide a place to which he shall flee. So the question is, what does it mean that God put it into his hand? Here, this is an accidental, again, we'll call it a murder, but it's not the typical murder. So what does it mean that God put it into his hands? So there is an amazing Rashi. I will read the first part and then I'll explain it. And you'll see why I'm doing this. So it says, why should this go forth from him? In other words, what does it mean that God put it into this person's hand that this other person should die through his agency? How do we understand that? So Rashi says, why should this go forth from him, meaning God? This is what King David said. And then it quotes from the book of Samuel and says, as the parable of the ancients says, from evil ones come evil. In other words, if someone is the agent for someone else's death, even though they didn't do it on purpose, they did not do it intentionally, but there must be some reason that this person was in the position to cause this other person's death. So that's what King David said. As the parable of the ancient says, from evil ones comes evil. Now listen to this. So what is this ancient parable? And the ancient parable refers to the Torah, which is the parable of God, who is the ancient one of the world. Now, to contemplate what this Rashi is telling us, this is what we've been learning tonight, that on a certain level, everything in the Torah, that's Pardes, that's the orchard, everything in the Torah, it doesn't depart from its simple literal meaning, but on every verse of the Torah, there is a way to read it as a parable. That's what it says. And the ancient parable refers to the Torah, which is the parable of God. In other words, here it's describing the entire Torah as the parable of God. So this is just an astounding Rashi. So then it says, but where does it say in the Torah that from evil ones come evil? It is implied in the words, and God had caused it to come into his hand. And what is this verse speaking about? So here's the case that Rashi brings. It's a long Rashi. It's a classic case. How do we understand that God put it into his hand? So Rashi says like this, there are two people. One person killed another person on purpose, but no one saw it and it couldn't be proven. So he escaped any punishment. And there's another person who caused another person to die inadvertently, not on purpose. But again, because there weren't witnesses, this person also never went to a city of refuge. So what happens here? So Rashi says, God, he uses the word, invites them or causes both of them to come to a hotel. And the one, everyone has to focus here, the one who killed on purpose is sitting under a tree. And the one who killed inadvertently climbs a ladder up the tree, and he falls off of it onto the one who killed on purpose. And that way, the one who killed on purpose is killed. But this time there are witnesses, and the one who fell off the ladder, who had escaped punishment from what he had caused the first time, now has to go to a city of refuge. And this is how divine justice works. It's an amazing Rashi, an incredible Rashi. But I brought it because here you have this incredible statement that what is this ancient parable that King David is talking about? Well, it's the Torah itself. And it's not just a parable, it's God's parable. So we're kind of out of time here, but I'll just end that the Baal Shem Tov was known as a storyteller. And his great appeal to what were called the simple Jew, the not so learned Jew, is he was able to take these incredible moral, ethical, spiritual, mystical ideas, and he crafted these stories, these parables, these metaphors. And his great grandson, and of course, this was picked up by the entire Hasidic movement, That's why you have so many Rebbes telling stories, but the greatest one was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe Nachman of Breslov, who became famous for telling these long, involved, incredibly creative stories. And you can go online and you can see there have been scores of commentaries written about these stories of Rebbe Nachman. So we'll just put this all together, that this is like an advertisement for learning according to Pardes, to understand that every verse in the Torah has a simple, literal, historic, straightforward, real meaning to it that we can relate to in the material world. It also has hints and allusions. And this is very much what the 70 Faces of the Torah is based on. All of these different hints and allusions. And then you have drush, where you have every verse, if you look deep enough, you could see the parable, the allegory, the symbolism, the metaphor. And then finally, we have what's called the secret meaning. And that this is where like the Zohar comes in, and many books of the Kabbalah that take the same Chumash, the same 5 books of Moses, and reveals incredibly deep, profound levels of spiritual meaning in these stories and mitzvot and verses. So may we all be blessed to be able to delve into the Torah on all of these levels and know that ultimately it's all one big picture.